Hello and welcome to our fireside, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Draw nearer the hearth, my dear listener, for the wind outside is sharp enough to cut flesh from bone, and the tale I have to tell is one of the coldest that ever chilled the blood of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 1. The Frost-Bound Visitor. It was the 14th of January, 1895, a date that will remain branded upon my memory as long as reason holds her seat. London lay in the iron grip of a frost more terrible than any in living recollection. For 3 weeks the thermometer had not once crept above zero. The Thames, that great artery of the empire, had ceased to flow and become instead a broad white highway stretching from Richmond to the Nore. Children skated where barges had lately passed. Coal porters dragged sledges over water that had carried East Indiamen. And at night the ice groaned and cracked like the report of distant artillery. At 221B Baker Street we felt the siege no less keenly than the rest of the metropolis. Our sitting-room windows were filmed with fern-like patterns of frost. The milk in the jug froze solid before Mrs. Hudson could pour it, and the very ink in my pen grew sluggish. Sherlock Holmes, that most restless of mortals, had passed the preceding days in a fever of enforced inactivity. He had exhausted his chemical experiments, fired 6 revolver bullets into the wall in the patriotic pattern of the VR, and reduced 3 violins to discord by attempting to discover whether the extreme cold affected the tension of catgut. By the evening of the 14th, he was pacing our carpet like a polar bear I once observed in the zoological gardens, his lean face gaunt with ennui. I had just persuaded him to abandon a project involving the freezing of tobacco ash for purposes of future identification when the bell rang below with a violence that suggested desperation. Mrs. Hudson's measured tread ascended the stair, and she appeared in the doorway wrapped in 3 shawls and an expression of severe disapproval. "A gentleman to see Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He would give no card, and he is bringing half the street snow in with him." "Show him up at once," cried Holmes, his eyes flashing with sudden life. "Snow upon the boots is often more eloquent than a visiting card." A moment later our visitor stood upon the threshold, and I confess the sight of him sent an involuntary shiver through me that was not entirely due to the draught. He was a tall man, above 6 feet, but so attenuated that he appeared even taller. His age I judged to be 50, though suffering had carved lines about his mouth and eyes that might have belonged to a far older person. His ulster was of expensive astrakhan, yet it hung upon him as though tailored for a larger frame. The collar was turned up about his ears, and his silk hat and gloves were white with rime. Most striking of all was his face, the skin stretched, parchment tight across prominent cheekbones, the color of old ivory, and the eyes sunken yet burning with a feverish intensity. Ice crystals glittered in his drooping mustache and upon his lashes. He remained for a moment framed in the doorway, swaying slightly as though the effort of climbing our 17 steps had exhausted his last reserve of strength. Then he spoke, and his voice, though cultured, was the thin, dry rustle of dead leaves. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "The same. Pray come in and stand near the fire. Watson, the brandy." I pressed a glass into the stranger's half-frozen fingers while Holmes, with that swift, noiseless grace that always reminded me of a panther, relieved him of hat and coat. Beneath the ulster the man wore impeccable evening dress, but the white tie was askew and the shirt front bore curious dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. "You have walked far?" inquired Holmes, his glance taking in every detail with the rapidity of a spectroscope. "From Hatton Garden," replied the stranger, though it might as well have been from Siberia. "My cab horse fell twice in the snow, and the 3rd time refused to rise. I dismissed the man and came on foot." He drained the brandy at a gulp, and a faint tinge of color returned to his lips. Then, with a gesture that was almost violent, he drew a large morocco case from his inner pocket and flung it upon the table. "My card," he said bitterly, "though it will convey little enough to you at present. Elias Hawthorne, senior partner in Hawthorne and Sons, diamond merchants of Hatton Garden and Amsterdam." Holmes raised an eyebrow a fraction. The name was not unknown to me. Even in Afghanistan, I had heard of Hawthorne's as one of the great houses of the trade. "Pray be seated, Mr. Hawthorne," said Holmes, indicating the basket chair opposite his own. "You have evidently come upon a matter of extreme urgency. The pulse," he had taken our visitor's wrist with a motion too swift to be refused, "is 120. The pupils are contracted and the extremities are still perilously cold. Watson, another brandy, and throw more coal on the fire." Mr. Hawthorne sank into the chair as though his legs had turned to water. For a full minute he stared into the flames, and when he spoke again his voice had fallen to a whisper that forced us both to lean forward to catch the words. "Mr. Holmes, my brother Reginald is dead, murdered, upon the ice of the frozen Thames, and the police say it is impossible." The word impossible acted upon Sherlock Holmes like a spark upon tinder. He seated himself opposite our visitor, his thin, eager face thrust forward, his fingertips pressed together in the attitude I had come to recognize as indicative of intense concentration. "Impossible crimes," he murmured almost to himself, "are my special delight. Pray be precise, Mr. Hawthorne. Begin at the beginning and omit no detail, however trivial it may appear." Elias Hawthorne passed a trembling hand across his brow, leaving a streak of half-melted snow. "Reginald was the younger by 5 years, but the genius of our house. It was he who negotiated the great Yakutsk contracts with the Russians, he who built our Amsterdam cutting works. Last night, Wednesday the 13th, he dined with me at the Savoy to celebrate the conclusion of a transaction that would have made us wealthier than even the De Beers syndicate. We parted a little after 11 o'clock. He said he would walk home across the temporary bridge at Blackfriars. The cabmen were asking extortionate fares because of the snow. That was the last time I saw him alive." He paused, and the silence was broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional groan of the ice on the river far below. "This morning at 7 o'clock, he continued, "a party of coal porters crossing the ice near the center of the river discovered." His voice failed utterly. With a shaking hand he drew from his pocket a photograph still damp from the dark room and laid it upon the table between us. I leaned forward and felt the blood recede from my heart. The picture showed a man lying supine upon the frozen surface of the Thames. He wore evening dress identical to that of the brother who now sat before us. His arms were outstretched as though in supplication or crucifixion. His eyes stared sightlessly at the leaden sky. Upon his breast, vivid against the black cloth and the surrounding whiteness, lay a single crimson rose, its petals rimmed with frost, yet miraculously unfaded. But it was the background that turned my medical nerves to ice. The body lay in the exact center of a great circular expanse of snow, perfectly smooth and unbroken. No footprint marred its surface in any direction for at least 30 yards. No track led toward the corpse. None led away. It was as though the dead man had been dropped from the heavens or had materialized upon the ice by some diabolical sorcery. Holmes examined the photograph through his lens for what seemed an eternity. When he spoke, his voice held that peculiar note of suppressed excitement that I had learned to recognize as the harbinger of battle. "Curious," he said softly. "Most curious. The rose is fresh. Observe the dew upon the outer petals. It did not freeze with the body. Someone placed it there after death and within the last few hours. Also, the disposition of the limbs suggests that rigor mortis had already begun when the body was arranged. Your brother died elsewhere, Mr. Hawthorne, and was brought to this spot." Yet how when the snow is virgin for 30 yards around? He turned the photograph to the light. And this faint discoloration beneath the left hand. Blood, I fancy, seeping into the ice. Death occurred upon the river after all. We have a pretty little problem here, Watson. A very pretty little problem indeed. Elias Hawthorne watched, him with the eyes of a drowning man, who sees the rope thrown at last. Then you will take the case? Holmes's answer was to rise and cross to the window. He flung it open, and the bitter air swept in, carrying with it the distant sound of skates upon the ice and the mournful hooting of a stranded steamer. "Take it!" he cried, his voice ringing with sudden energy. "My dear sir, if I do not unravel this knot before another day has passed, I shall retire to Sussex and keep bees for the remainder of my life. Watson, my hat and coat, and the muffler your thoughtful patient knitted last Christmas. We are going to view a corpse upon the most remarkable stage in England, the frozen Thames herself." He turned back to our visitor, and the gleam in his eye was almost fierce. "Mr. Hawthorne, return to your office and await my instructions. Speak of this to no one, not even the police, until you hear from me. The game, my dear sir, has begun." Chapter 2. The Body on the Ice. The dawn that followed was of that peculiar pallor which only a great city locked in frost can produce, a sullen, leaden light that seemed to leach all color from the world. Holmes and I left Baker Street while the streets still rang with the crunch of the scavengers' carts and the muffled curses of cabmen coaxing half-frozen horses into motion. The air was so cold it stung the lungs. Each breath hung before us like a small white ghost before vanishing. We took the district railway to Blackfriars, the carriage windows opaque with frost flowers, and emerged onto the embankment to a spectacle I shall never forget. The Thames, that restless, muddy serpent I had known all my life, had become a vast white plain stretching away on every side, broken only by the black ribs of stranded lighters and the scarlet sparks of braziers where skaters warmed their hands. Booths and tents had sprung up overnight, gingerbread sellers, roast chestnut braziers, even a fiddler sawing away upon a stool of frozen coal sacks. London, indomitable as ever, had turned her greatest calamity into a carnival. A knot of constables guarded the approaches to the body. Lestrade was already there, his nose purple, his whiskers bristling with indignation and cold. He greeted us with the mixture of relief and resentment that had become customary. "Glad you're here, Mr. Holmes," he said, rubbing mittened hands. "Though I warn you, this one will baffle even you. Not a mark on the snow, clean as a ballroom floor after the dancers have gone." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes were everywhere. He strode out upon the ice with that light, springing step that always reminded me of a bloodhound quartering ground. I followed more cautiously, for though the frost was iron-hard, the river beneath groaned and muttered like some great beast disturbed in sleep. The body lay almost exactly in midstream, 200 yards from the nearest bank. Reginald Hawthorne had been a handsome man in life, tall, broad-shouldered, with the aquiline features of his brother. But death had already begun its work. The face was marble white, the lips faintly blue, the eyes half open and glazed with rime. His evening cloak had been thrown open, and upon the starched shirt front, vivid as a wound, lay the crimson rose. Holmes knelt at once. For fully 5 minutes he remained motionless, his lens traveling slowly over every inch of the corpse and the surrounding snow. Then with infinite care he brushed away the light powdering of fresh flakes that had fallen during the night. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The surface here was disturbed before the last snowfall. Beneath this superficial layer the ice is roughened, minute scratches radiating from the body like the ripples from a stone dropped in water. Someone dragged a heavy weight across the river, and the falling snow filled the marks almost as quickly as they were made." He produced a small thermometer and laid it upon the ice. -18 degrees. At this temperature, snow crystals form slowly, A track made at 1 o'clock would be completely obliterated by 4. Our murderer is a student of the weather. Lestrade snorted. Weather won't help you when there's no prints to begin with. Holmes ignored him. With his penknife, he scraped delicately at the ice beneath the dead man's left shoulder. A faint pink stain appeared. Blood, he said softly, seeping through the coat. The heart was still beating when the body was placed here, though only for moments. Death occurred upon the ice itself. He lifted the rose with tweezers and examined it against the light. The petals were perfect, the stem freshly cut, yet every drop of moisture had turned to tiny crystals of ice that sparkled like diamonds. This was not carried in an ordinary pocket, he announced. The flower has been kept in a vacuum flask or some similar insulated container. Otherwise, it would have frozen solid hours ago. Someone wished the rose to remain beautiful even in death. He bent closer to the corpse's face. Note the faint almond odor about the lips. Prussic acid, hydrocyanic acid, administered in massive dose. Death within seconds. The pupils are contracted to pinpoints, the jaw rigid, classic. I felt the old familiar chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Cyanide is a soldier's death. Swift, silent, certain. Whoever had planned this murder had left nothing to chance. Holmes rose and began to walk in ever-widening circles, his gaze fixed upon the snow. At 30 yards, he stopped and beckoned me over. Look here, pressure ridges. The ice buckled slightly under weight, then refroze. 3 separate lines converging toward the body. A sled, Watson. A low Norwegian sled such as children use on the Norwegian lakes. The runners leave only the faintest trace, and the snow filled them almost at once. He straightened, his eyes gleaming. The picture is becoming clear. Your brother, Mr. Hawthorne, was lured or forced onto the ice after midnight. He was poisoned. Probably offered a flask of brandy against the cold already laced with the acid. When he fell, the murderer arranged the body, placed the rose, and departed upon the sled, trusting the predicted snowfall to hide his tracks. By 4 o'clock the stage was set, the curtain ready to rise upon an impossible crime. Lestrade, who had been listening with growing impatience, burst out, "Very pretty, Mr. Holmes, but where's your proof? Where's this wonderful sled?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Proof, Inspector, is what we are standing upon. Watson, oblige me by walking 20 paces due north and then examining the ice closely." I did as he asked. Beneath the fresh snow, I found what he had seen, a narrow groove no wider than my thumb running straight as a ruled line toward the Surrey shore. It vanished beneath newer drifts, but it was there. Lestrade stared, his jaw working. "Well, I'm blessed." Holmes was already striding away, his voice floating back over the wind. "Come, Watson. The game grows warmer even while the river freezes. Before nightfall, we shall know whether this rose was sent by a lover or an executioner." Chapter 3. Footprints that vanished. By the time we regained Baker Street, the short winter day was already dying, and the gas lamps along the thoroughfare glimmered like a chain of pale moons through the thickening dusk. Holmes flung himself into his armchair, still in his ulster. His lean hands clasped, his eyes fixed upon the fire as though he could read the future in the dancing flames. I knew better than to interrupt him when that mood was upon him. Instead, I busied myself with lighting the spirit kettle and preparing a strong cup of coffee, for we had eaten nothing since dawn. For nearly an hour, he sat motionless save for the occasional drawing of his pipe, the blue smoke curling upward in slow spirals toward the ceiling. At last he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "The key, Watson, is the snow itself. Our murderer required a fall heavy enough to obliterate sled marks within minutes, yet light enough not to conceal the body entirely. That demands precise knowledge of the hour when the flakes would begin. The ordinary newspapers gave only vague predictions. The murderer possessed certainty, He rose and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain. Outside, the snow had begun again, large, lazy flakes drifting down like feathers from some vast white bird. "Observe," he said. "This is the very fall that covered the tracks last night. It began at 1:30 and continued until 4. The official meteorological office report will confirm it. But who, apart from the observers at Kew or Greenwich, could have known the exact moment?" I set down the coffee cup. The police? The river authorities? Possible, but unlikely. Lestrade himself was astonished by the absence of prints. No, our man had access to privileged information. He moved to the table where he had spread a large-scale map of the Thames and its approaches, together with the tide tables and shipping notices. With a pencil, he marked the spot where the body had lain, then drew 3 faint lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. 3 possible routes, he murmured. North to the Temple Stairs, south to the Surrey Wharves, or downstream toward the pool. The sled grooves we discovered pointed south, yet they were almost obliterated. The murderer may have doubled back. Clever. A sharp ring at the bell interrupted him. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram upon a salver. Holmes tore it open and his eyebrows rose. "From Elias Hawthorne," he said. "Listen to this. Another crimson rose delivered to my brother's house this morning, addressed to the widow. Wrapped in black crepe, no card, servants terrified." He crushed the paper in his hand. "So the game continues. The rose is not merely a signature, it is a warning or perhaps a promise. In the language of flowers, a single red rose signifies passionate love. Frozen, it becomes, 'I shall love you even unto death.' Delivered after death, it is a threat. Our murderer is either a romantic or a sadist, possibly both." I ventured a suggestion. Russian, perhaps? The diamond trade with St. Petersburg is thick with intrigue, and the Yakutsk mines are worked by convicts. I have heard tales in the clubs of exiled counts and countesses who carry vengeance in their blood. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Capital, Watson. You improve. The Russian angle must be explored. But first, the weather." He seized his hat. "Come. We are going to visit the one man in London who can tell us who received private forecasts last night." Half an hour later, our cab set us down before a somber building in Great George Street, where the Meteorological Council had its offices. The porter, recognizing Holmes from some earlier inquiry, admitted us without question. We were shown into a dimly lit room filled with barographs and whirling anemometers, where a thin, anxious gentleman in spectacles rose to greet us. "Mr. Holmes, this is an unexpected honor. How may the council assist you?" Holmes wasted no words. "Last night's snowfall between 1 and 4 o'clock. Who outside your own observers received advance notice of the exact hour?" The gentleman, Mr. Scott, the assistant secretary, hesitated. "Such information is confidential, but in a case of murder, there were only 3 private recipients: the Port of London Authority, the Admiralty's Ice Patrol, and," he lowered his voice, "a certain Mrs. Reginald Hawthorne, who subscribes through her late father's influence. Admiral Sir Charles Beaumont was one of our founders, you see. The family still enjoys certain privileges." Holmes's face was a study. "Mrs. Hawthorne received an exact forecast? You are certain?" "Positive. The telegram was dispatched at 11:45 yesterday evening. I signed it myself." We emerged into the street to find the snow falling thicker than ever. Holmes stood bareheaded, letting the flakes settle on his hair while he thought. "The widow," he said at last. "Interesting. A woman who knows precisely when the snow will fall to cover her husband's murder. Yet she was supposedly at her sister's house in Kensington. We must test that alibi." He hailed a passing hansom. "Kensington first, then Hatton Garden, and Watson," he smiled that keen, dangerous smile of his, Keep your revolver handy. Frozen roses are pretty things, but I mislike the thorn. As we rattled westward through the swirling snow, I could not rid my mind of the image of that single crimson blossom lying upon a dead man's heart, nor of the invisible footprints that had walked across the Thames and vanished as completely as though they had never been. Chapter 4. The Widow in Black. The Hawthorne residence stood in the hushed, moneyed gloom of Hyde Park Gardens, its tall windows shuttered against the daylight as though the house itself were in mourning. Snow lay in smooth, unbroken drifts across the steps. No visitor had crossed that threshold since the terrible news broke. A black wreath hung upon the door, the crepe already stiff with frost. Holmes tugged the bell pull, and after a long interval the door was opened by a maid whose eyes were red and swollen. She conducted us through a hall where every mirror had been veiled and the tall clock silenced, as is the custom when death has entered the house. The air smelled of camphor and dying flowers. We were shown into the drawing room, a cavern of mahogany and crimson plush, its fire burning low. For a moment the room appeared empty. Then a figure rose from a high-backed chair beside the hearth, and I saw the widow. Clara Hawthorne was younger than I had expected, no more than 30, and possessed of a beauty that the heavy mourning only accentuated. Her gown was of lusterless bombazine, the jet beads glittering like drops of frozen water. Her skin was pale to translucency, the lips bloodless, yet the eyes, large, dark, and luminous, held a feverish brilliance that reminded me unpleasantly of Elias Hawthorne's own stricken gaze. She wore no jewelry save a single black pearl upon a slender finger. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said in a voice low and perfectly controlled. "My brother-in-law wrote that you might call. Pray be seated." Holmes remained standing, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "Madam, I intrude upon your grief at the earliest possible moment because time is a luxury your husband's murderer does not grant us. Another rose was delivered here this morning, I believe." A flicker crossed her face, too swift for any eye less keen than Holmes's. "You are correctly informed. It came by district messenger at 10 o'clock. The boy could tell me nothing of who sent it." She moved to a side table and lifted a small black box. Within, nestling upon cotton wool, lay a crimson rose so dark it was almost black at the heart. The petals were perfect, yet each edge was rimed with frost that did not melt even in the warmth of the room. Holmes examined it without touching. "Kept in ice until the moment of delivery. The symbolism is unmistakable. Someone wishes you to know that the hand which struck your husband is still free and still active." She met his gaze steadily. "Then find that hand, Mr. Holmes. My husband had enemies. 6 months ago he discovered that a large consignment of Russian stones, blood diamonds from the Yakutsk mines, were entering London disguised as industrial bort. He intended to expose the ring at the next meeting of the Diamond Syndicate. The leaders are ruthless. Their chief is a woman known in St. Petersburg as Countess Olga Voronina. They say she signs her warnings with a frozen rose." Holmes's expression did not alter, yet I saw the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth that betokened intense interest. "And you, madam, where were you between midnight and 4 o'clock on the morning of the murder?" "With my sister, Lady Constance Paget, in Kensington. We sat up until nearly 3 discussing family matters. My maid and Lady Constance's butler can confirm it." "Most convenient," murmured Holmes. "And your interest in meteorological forecasts, how do you explain that?" For the first time the widow's composure wavered. A faint flush rose beneath the pallor. "My late father, Admiral Beaumont, helped establish the private weather service. I received the bulletins as a courtesy. Reginald often needed to know when the Baltic would freeze for insurance purposes, that is all." Holmes bowed slightly. "I trouble you no further at present, madam. My condolences." As we moved toward the door, he paused, seemingly as an afterthought, beside the letterbox set into the wall. He passed his gloved hand lightly across the brass flap, then raised the fingers to his nose. The movement was so quick that only I, who knew his habits, recognized it for what it was. In the hansom, he was silent for some minutes, his eyes half closed. Then he spoke, almost to himself. "Attar of roses, the identical perfume found upon the glove in the iceworks laboratory we have yet to discover." And the widow's pulse, when she spoke of the Countess, rose from 72 to 98. Fear, Watson, or guilt? Possibly both. I stared at him. You believe she is involved? I believe she is the pivot upon which the entire case turns. A woman who knows exactly when snow will fall to cover a murder, who receives frozen roses after her husband's death, who speaks of a mysterious Russian countess with the familiarity of an intimate. Mark my words, Watson. Before this thaw comes, Mrs. Clara Hawthorne will either stand revealed as the most injured of innocents or the most dangerous woman in London. The snow was falling faster now, blotting out the great houses of Hyde Park Gardens as though drawing a white curtain across the stage before the next act of the tragedy. Chapter 5. The Russian Connection. That same evening found us in the warm, brandy-scented gloom of the Diogenes Club, where Holmes had insisted we dine with an old college acquaintance of mine, Sir Rufus Stone of the Foreign Office. The great freeze had emptied London of its usual chatterers, and we had the strangers' room almost to ourselves. A coal fire roared in the grate. Outside, the snow hissed against the high windows like a living thing. Sir Rufus was a thin, ascetic man with a monocle and the weary eyes of one who has read too many secret dispatches. He greeted me warmly, regarded Holmes with cautious curiosity, and when the port had been circulated, listened without interruption while Holmes laid the salient facts before him. The frozen corpse, the vanished footprints, the crimson roses, the meteorological forecasts, the whisper of Russian diamonds. When Holmes had finished, Sir Rufus removed his monocle and polished it slowly. "You tread upon dangerous ice, Mr. Holmes, even more dangerous than the Thames," he said at last. "For 2 years, the Foreign Office and the Yard have been trying to lay hands upon the woman you describe. Her true name is Countess Olga Voronina, formerly prima ballerina of the Imperial Mariinsky Theater. In '93, she poisoned Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich with a distillation of cherry stones, cyanide, as you have surmised. The Tsar's secret police hunted her across Europe. She vanished, and 6 months later the Yakutsk mines began bleeding stones into the west." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though we were alone. "The route is ingenious. Diamonds are sewn into the hollow steel runners of ice yachts racing on the Gulf of Finland. When the yachts reach London as sporting visitors, the stones are simply unscrewed and vanish into Hatton Garden. The Countess, or the Ice Countess as the Russian police call her, signs every warning with a single crimson rose frozen at the moment of perfect bloom. She is said to keep a hothouse in some secret place in a private laboratory where she distills her poisons. Men who crossed her have been found frozen in locked rooms, roses clenched between their teeth." Holmes's eyes gleamed like polished steel. "And the meteorological forecasts?" Sir Rufus permitted himself a wintry smile. "Ah, that is the Admiralty's newest toy, a private telegraphic service for the Baltic Fleet, accurate to the quarter hour. Only a dozen copies of each bulletin are struck. One goes to the Port Authority, one to the Ice Patrol, and one, through the influence of the late Admiral Beaumont, to his daughter, Mrs. Reginald Hawthorne. The Countess would sell her soul for such information. Snow is her accomplice. She times every move to the fall of the first flake." Holmes set down his glass with a click. "Then the circle narrows. The widow either sells the forecast to the Russians or she is herself the Countess's creature, perhaps both. Sir Rufus raised a warning hand. Be careful, Mr. Holmes, the woman is a tigress. 2 agents who came too close were found on the ice of the Neva. One with a bullet through the heart, the other with a frozen rose in his mouth. Holmes rose, buttoning his ulster. I have never feared tigresses, Sir Rufus. It is the lamb in wolf's clothing that merits caution. Come, Watson, we have an appointment with a lady who knows exactly when the snow will fall. As we stepped out into the night, the wind had risen, driving the snow almost horizontally along Pall Mall. The street lamps glowed like funeral lanterns. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9, its note deadened by the storm. Holmes turned up his collar. Mark this night, Watson. Before the clocks strike 12, we shall either have unmasked the Ice Countess, or we shall ourselves become exhibits in her frozen gallery. He plunged into the swirling darkness, and I followed, revolver heavy in my pocket, the taste of danger sharp upon my tongue. The snow closed behind us like a white curtain, and London for one brief hour belonged to the hunters and the hunted alone. Chapter 6. A Second Death. The second murder came like a second blow from the same invisible hand, swift, silent, and impossible. It was just past midnight when the urgent knocking began at 221B. I stumbled from my bedroom to find Holmes already in his dressing gown, admitting a half-frozen constable whose helmet and greatcoat were white with snow. Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, the man panted, but Inspector Lestrade says you're to come at once. Another of the Hawthorne partners, Mr. Percival Blaine, found dead in the cold storage vault at Butler's Wharf. Door bolted on the inside, temperature 30 below, and a red rose frozen to his tongue. The inspector says it's the devil's own work. Holmes's eyes blazed. In 3 minutes we were dressed and clattering down the stairs into a four-wheeler that slid and skidded through the deserted streets like a drunken thing. The docks were a realm of nightmare. Snow had drifted high against the warehouses. The masts of frozen ships rose above us like the ribs of dead beasts. Lestrade met us at the entrance to the great ice warehouse, his face blue, his mustache stiff with rime. I said you'd want to see this one yourself, he growled. And I don't mind admitting I'm out of my depth. He led us down iron stairs into the bowels of the building. The cold struck like a physical blow. Our breath froze in the air. At the far end of a long vault where carcasses of Argentine beef hung in glittering rows stood a steel door. It was shut and bolted, massively bolted from the inside. Lestrade pointed to a small Judas window set in the door. Through the frost we could see the body. Percival Blaine sat propped against a crate, his eyes wide in frozen horror, his skin white and hard as porcelain. His fur coat was thrown open, the waistcoat and shirt beneath had been torn apart as though by his own hands in the final agony. Between the clenched teeth protruded the stem of a crimson rose, the bloom itself frozen into a jewel of ice that caught the lantern light and threw back blood-red sparks. Found at 11 by the night watchman, Lestrade said. He looked through the grill, saw the body, and nearly dropped dead himself. The key was in the lock inside, the bolt shot home. No other door, no ventilator large enough for a cat. Temperature kept at 30 below to preserve the meat. The man must have walked in, bolted himself up, poisoned himself, and sat down to die. But why, Mr. Holmes? Why? Holmes had already produced his lens. He examined the bolt, the key, the frost upon the floor with that feverish intensity I knew so well. Observe, he murmured. The bolt is drawn, certainly, but the metal is scratched where a thread has been drawn across it. Note also the tiny hole bored beneath the hasp, no larger than a darning needle. A silk thread was passed through, the door pulled to, the bolt drawn by the thread from the outside, then the thread cut and withdrawn. The cold preserved the ice filament long enough for the deception to succeed. He turned to the corpse. With delicate fingers, he opened the rigid jaws and removed the rose. The stem had been forced deep into the throat. The petals were perfect, untouched by decay. Again kept in liquid air or some similar refrigerant until the last moment, he said. The cyanide was administered in crystalline form, probably introduced into a cigar. Observe the characteristic staining of the lips and the odor of bitter almonds. Death in under a minute, yet the convulsions were violent enough to tear the clothing. Lestrade stared. But the thread, how could anyone know the vault would be empty at that hour? Holmes brushed frost from the floor with his glove. Beneath lay faint traces of Russian tobacco, the same strong mixture we had noticed near Reginald Hawthorne's body. Because the appointment was made, he replied. Mr. Blaine was lured here by someone he trusted, someone who knew these vaults well and could guarantee privacy. The murderer waited until the convulsions began, then performed the simple trick with the thread. By the time the watchman made his round, the ice had erased every trace. He straightened, and in the lantern light his face was terrible. 2 partners dead within 3 days. The third, Elias Hawthorne, will not see another sunrise unless we act swiftly. The Ice Countess is closing her account, and she does not intend to leave a living witness. Outside, the wind howled through the rigging of the frozen ships like a choir of lost souls. Somewhere in that white wilderness a woman moved unseen, carrying death in a crystal vial and crimson roses that never faded. Holmes turned up his collar. Chapter 7. The Frozen Laboratory. The clue that led us to the iceworks was no more than a few strands of coarse Russian tobacco frozen into the snow beside Blaine's body. Yet to Holmes they shone like a trail of fire. By 3 in the morning we were threading the rat-run alleys of Limehouse, the wind knifing down from the northeast and driving the snow into our faces with spiteful force. The Thames lay to our left, black water now showing between shifting plates of ice, for the great freeze was beginning to break at last. Holmes halted before a high brick wall topped with broken glass. A faded sign read, "Limehouse Ice Manufactory, closed by order 1892. The gates hung askew on rust-eaten hinges. He produced a small bullseye lantern, shaded the beam with his glove, and we slipped inside. The yard was a wilderness of snow-covered machinery. Great iron flywheels, ammonia compressors half buried, and a tall chimney that stabbed the low sky like a broken lance. In the center rose the main building, its windows blind with frost, yet from a crack beneath the loading doors seeped a faint bluish light that did not flicker like ordinary flame. Holmes laid a finger to his lips and led the way. The door yielded to his picklocks with scarcely a sound. We stepped into a cavernous space where the cold was of a different order entirely, dry, intense, and smelling faintly of chemicals. Our breath did not cloud. It froze instantly into tiny diamonds that fell tinkling to the floor. Before us stretched a scene out of a fever dream. Rows of Dewar flasks glowed with pale cerulean fire, each containing a single crimson rose suspended in liquid air, petals spread in eternal bloom. The temperature was so low that the glass itself sang with faint crystalline notes. Along one wall stood retorts and fractionating columns crusted with hoarfrost. On a marble slab lay surgical instruments of Russian silver, and beside them a human hand, thank God only a wax anatomical model, frozen in an attitude of supplication. Holmes moved forward like a man in a cathedral. He lifted one of the flasks, and the rose within turned slowly, a captive jewel. "Liquid air at -190 degrees, he murmured. "The Countess preserves her signatures at the moment of perfection. Beautiful and deadly." In a corner stood a small portable forge, its coals still warm. Upon the anvil lay a steel runner from an ice yacht, hollow with a screw cap at one end. Holmes unscrewed it and poured into his palm a stream of rough diamonds that flashed even in that ghastly light. "The Yakutsk stones," he said softly. "The smuggling route confirmed." A sudden sound, metal ringing upon metal, came from the far end of the laboratory. Holmes extinguished the lantern. In the blue glow we saw a door open and a tall figure in a long white coat emerge, carrying a silver tray on which something steamed faintly. The figure was a woman, statuesque, the hood thrown back to reveal hair of pale gold bound in a severe knot. Even at that distance, the beauty of the face was apparent, classic, cold, and cruel as winter itself. She crossed to a workbench, set down the tray, and began to fill small glass vials from a retort. Cyanide crystals glittered like snow as they fell. Holmes touched my arm and we retreated behind a bank of compressors. The woman worked swiftly, humming a fragment of a Russian lullaby under her breath. When she turned, the light caught the side of her face and I saw a tiny scar shaped like a crescent moon beneath the left eye. The mark Sir Rufus had told us, by which the Okhrana had once identified Countess Olga Voronina. She finished her task, stoppered the last vial, and placed it in a velvet-lined case already half full of similar tubes. Then she opened a small lacquered box and took out a single perfect rose. Holding it by the stem with silver tongs, she dipped it into a Dewar flask. When she withdrew it, the flower was encased in a sheath of ice that sparkled like diamond dust. She laid it gently beside the phials and closed the lid. Holmes's hand closed on my wrist like a vice. His lips formed one silent word: "Now." But at that instant the woman stiffened. She had seen our reflections in the polished copper of a retort. In one fluid motion, she snatched a small nickel-plated revolver from her apron pocket and fired twice. The reports were deafening in the confined space. Bullets screamed off iron and a flask exploded in a shower of liquid air that flash-froze a patch of floor to mirror smoothness. We flung ourselves apart. Holmes rolled behind a stack of crates. I dropped flat and brought my old service revolver to bear. The woman, the Countess, ran not for the door by which she had entered, but for a smaller hatch in the wall. She reached it, flung it open, and vanished into the night. Holmes was already in pursuit. I followed, lungs burning with the deadly cold. We burst out into a narrow alley where a light ice sledge awaited, a single horse stamping in the snow. The Countess leapt aboard, slashed the reins, and the horse sprang forward with a scream of iron-shod hooves on cobblestones. Holmes seized a mooring rope from a nearby barge, whirled it once around his head, and hurled it. The grapnel caught in the rear of the sledge. For a moment the horse dragged him along, boots plowing twin furrows in the snow. Then the rope snapped taut and the sledge slewed violently, overturning in a whirlwind of white. The Countess was on her feet in an instant, revolver leveled. Holmes walked toward her steadily, empty hands spread wide. "Countess Olga Voronina," he called in clear, carrying tones. "The game is over. Drop the weapon." She laughed, a low musical sound that chilled me more than the air, and raised the revolver higher. At that moment the church clock of St. Anne's began to strike. 4. In the silence between the strokes we heard another sound, the low, ominous groaning of the ice on the river, growing louder, nearer. The Countess's beautiful face twisted. She glanced toward the Thames, then back at Holmes. For one heartbeat I thought she would fire. Instead she smiled, a smile more terrible than any snarl, pressed the muzzle beneath her chin and pulled the trigger. The report echoed across the breaking ice like a cannon shot. She fell backward into a drift, the snow blooming crimson around her golden head. Holmes stood over her for a long moment. When he turned to me, his face was grim. "Not the Countess, Watson," he said quietly. "A deputy, fanatical but only a deputy. The true ice countess still walks free, and the most dangerous part of the hunt has only just begun. Behind us, the great blocks of ice on the Thames cracked and boomed like artillery, and somewhere in the darkness I thought I heard the faint mocking echo of a woman's laughter carried on the north wind. Chapter 8. The Cipher in the Snow. The false countess lay upon a slab at the police mortuary, her golden hair dulled by death, the crescent scar livid against the pallor. She had carried no papers, only a small silver locket containing a miniature photograph of Clara Hawthorne and a slip of paper on which was written, in violet ink, a single line of Russian. "Love is stronger than ice." Holmes studied the words for a long while, then slipped the paper into his pocketbook without comment. It was nearly noon, and London was beginning to stir again. The thaw had set in with a vengeance. Water dripped from every eave, gutters ran like torrents, and the great sheets of ice on the Thames were breaking up with reports like rifle fire. The city looked ashamed of its brief carnival and anxious to forget. We had returned to Baker Street barely long enough for coffee and a change of clothes when Billy the page burst in, half frozen and triumphant, waving an envelope sealed with crimson wax. "Delivered by a district messenger boy, sir. He said a lady in a veil paid him double to bring it straight here and wait for no answer." Holmes slit the envelope with his fruit knife. Inside lay one fresh crimson petal and a card of heavy ivory paper. Upon it, in the same violet ink, was written, "To the only man worthy of the game, meet me where the river forgets to flow, when Big Ben forgets to strike. Come alone, or the good doctor joins the roses." Holmes's eyes glittered like ice under moonlight. "The frozen Thames at midnight," he translated softly. "During the hour the great bell is silenced for cleaning, an invitation and a challenge. She grows bold, Watson, almost reckless." I protested with all the vigor of an old campaigner who smells an ambush, but Holmes cut me short. "She will not fire upon me while the game amuses her. Besides, I have no intention of walking blindfold into her parlor." The rest of the day he spent in a fever of preparation. Maps were consulted, meteorological tables pored over, and from his bedroom emerged the faint, unmistakable odor of the chemicals he used in his private experiments. At dusk, he handed me a small, flat pistol, a Belgian Le Faucheux, and a pair of ice creepers for my boots. "You will follow at 200 yards, he instructed. "Keep to the Surrey side until the last moment. If I raise my lantern 3 times, bring Lestrade and his men from the Blackfriars Bridge station. Otherwise, trust me." Night fell early and thick. A warm, wet wind had risen, driving ragged clouds across the moon. The river was a chaos of grinding flows and black water. Lanterns on the bridges bobbed like will-o'-the-wisps. At 11:30, Holmes left the house alone, a tall, lean figure in ulster and deerstalker, the red tip of his cigarette the only spark of warmth in the darkness. I gave him 5 minutes, then followed. The embankment was almost deserted. A few drunken revelers staggered home from the Surrey music halls, singing hoarsely. The ice groaned and splintered. Somewhere a great plate overturned with a crash like thunder. I kept to the shadows, revolver in pocket, heart beating high. At the stroke of 12, the bells of Westminster fell silent. Big Ben stilled for its weekly winding. The sudden hush was uncanny, as though London herself held her breath. Holmes was a dim silhouette in the center of the broken ice field, perhaps 100 yards from the Surrey shore. A pale moon escaped the clouds and silvered the scene. Then I saw her. She stood upon a wide floe that had grounded against a buoy, tall and queenly in a long cloak of white fur, the hood thrown back so that her dark hair streamed like a banner. Even at that distance, the beauty of the face was apparent. Clara Hawthorne no longer in mourning, but radiant, terrible, exalted. At her feet lay a small, portable brazier glowing cherry red. Beside it, an insulated silver cylinder from which she drew, one by one, crimson roses that did not wilt in the warm air. Holmes approached slowly, hands in plain sight. Words passed between them, too low for me to hear, but I saw the woman laugh and extend one gloved hand as though offering partnership or perhaps surrender. Then in an instant everything changed. She stepped back, whipped a slender pistol from her cloak, and fired point-blank at Holmes's breast. He must have been expecting it. He twisted like a dancer, the bullet tearing only the sleeve of his ulster. In the same heartbeat he flung something small and bright, a pair of handcuffs linked by a fine steel chain. The chain whipped around her wrist with a metallic snap. She screamed, once, a high, furious sound, and fired again. The bullet grazed Holmes's temple. I saw the dark line of blood appear against the white skin. Yet he held the chain, dragging her toward him across the ice. I was already running, boots slipping on the wet surface, revolver out. The flow shifted dangerously under their combined weight. With a report like a cannon, the ice split. A black chasm of water yawned between them. For one terrible second, Clara Hawthorne teetered on the edge, the handcuff chain taut as a bowstring, her face contorted with rage and fear. Then the flow tilted. She clawed at the air, the white cloak billowing like broken wings, and fell backward into the Thames. Holmes flung himself flat, the chain whipping through his fingers until the handcuff caught on a jagged spur of ice. He lay half over the edge, arm outstretched, holding the full weight of the drowning woman while the black water boiled beneath her. I reached him in time to seize his coat. Together we hauled. She came up gasping, hair streaming, the fur cloak sodden and heavy as lead. Between us, we dragged her onto the floe. She lay on her side, coughing river water, the fight gone out of her like air from a burst balloon. Holmes knelt, breathing hard, blood running down his cheek. "Clara Hawthorne," he said formally, "I arrest you for the murders of your husband Reginald and of Percival Blaine, and for conspiracy to smuggle Russian diamonds. The rest can wait." She lifted her head. The beautiful eyes were empty now, like a house from which the tenant has fled. "Love is stronger than ice," she whispered, echoing the dead woman's locket. Then she laughed, a dreadful, broken sound, and fainted clean away. Behind us, police whistles sounded as Lestrade's men came pounding across the bridge. The thaw had won. The river was flowing again, carrying great blocks of ice seaward like the fragments of a shattered dream. Holmes sat back on his heels, dabbing at the blood on his temple with a handkerchief already soaked. Chapter 9. The Midnight Chase. Across the Thames, the moon hung low and ragged over London, a tarnished coin caught in the flying clouds of the thaw. The night was no longer frozen. A damp, warm wind had risen from the southwest, driving the temperature upward with every passing minute. Water dripped from every cornice, gurgled in every gutter, and the great river itself had begun to mutter and roar as the ice broke into 1,000 moving islands. Holmes had refused a police escort. He stood alone upon the Blackfriars footbridge at 11:30, a tall, lean silhouette against the red glow of the city, his ulster flapping like a battle standard. In his left hand he carried a dark lantern. In his right, the ivory card with its violet challenge. I watched from the shadow of the northern abutment, revolver ready, heart hammering against my ribs. At 11:55, the bells of the city fell silent one by one, until even the distant chime of St. Paul's was stilled. Big Ben itself was mute, its great hammer removed for cleaning. In that unnatural hush, the river sounded louder than artillery, grinding, cracking, booming as floes the size of omnibuses crashed together and spun away downstream. Then I saw her. She came from the Surrey side, walking boldly across the shifting ice as though it were solid pavement. A long cloak of white fox fur billowed behind her. The hood was thrown back and the wind tore at her dark hair. Even at 200 yards, there was no mistaking Clara Hawthorne. No longer the pale widow in bombazine, but a figure out of Norse saga, beautiful and deadly. At her belt hung the silver insulated cylinder I had seen in the iceworks, and in her gloved hand she carried a slender riding whip that glinted like steel. Holmes descended the temporary steps to the ice and went to meet her. I crept along the bridge parapet, keeping him in sight. The floes were moving now, grinding and tilting. Black water showed between them like wounds. Yet the two figures advanced until they stood face to face upon a single broad plate no more than 20 yards across, lit by moonlight and the red glare of a brazier the woman had kindled at her feet. I was too far to hear their words, but I saw her laugh, head thrown back, throat white as marble, and extend one hand, palm upward, in a gesture that might have been invitation or command. Holmes answered, calm and deliberate. For a space of perhaps 2 minutes they spoke, the woman circling slowly, Holmes turning to keep her in view. Then everything happened at once. She stepped back, the cloak swirling and the riding whip flashed upward. No whip, but a slender Caucasian kinjal, its blade catching the moon in a streak of silver. Holmes flung up his arm. The knife slashed through the ulster sleeve, and I saw blood spring dark. In the same instant, he hurled the contents of his right hand full in her face, a cloud of white powder that sparkled as it fell. It was his chemical mixture of lycopodium and magnesium, flash powder used in photography. Ignited by the brazier, it exploded in a blinding roar of white flame. She screamed, staggered, clawing at her eyes. Holmes lunged forward, seized her wrist, and snapped a handcuff upon it. The steel chain sang between them like a living thing. For a heartbeat, they were locked together on the tilting floe. Then the ice cracked with a report like a 12-pounder. A chasm of black water yawned. The floe split in two. Clara Hawthorne wrenched free, the open cuff dangling from her wrist. She turned and ran southward across the moving fragments, leaping from one to another with the grace of a dancer, or a murderess who knows every inch of her killing ground. Holmes followed, bleeding but relentless, the chain of the handcuff still gripped in his left hand. I was already racing down the embankment steps, boots slipping on the wet iron. The chase became a nightmare ballet, two tiny figures darting across the breaking river while the moon painted everything silver and scarlet. Ice groaned and overturned, great blocks rose on end and crashed down again. Once Holmes slipped to his knees in freezing water, but he was up in an instant, coat streaming, closing the distance. She reached, the broadest floe yet, an island 30 yards long grounded against the central pier of Waterloo Bridge. There, waiting in the lee of the pier, was a narrow ice yacht, its runner blades gleaming, its single lateen sail already drawing the warm wind. Two men in fur caps stood ready at the sheets, Russian seamen by their look. Clara Hawthorne sprang aboard. The yacht heeled, gathered way, and shot forward like a greyhound heading downstream where the fairway was opening. Holmes was 20 yards behind and losing ground. He cast one swift glance around, saw the broken spar of a lighter drifting past, and leapt for it without hesitation. Using the spar as a pole, he vaulted from floe to floe, gaining with every desperate bound. 10 yards. 5. The yacht was gathering speed, the sail bellying full. At the last possible instant, he flung himself forward. His outstretched hand caught the yacht's stern runner. For a moment, he was dragged through the water like a hooked salmon. Then he found purchase and swung himself aboard in a single motion. The Russians turned with drawn knives, but Clara Hawthorne shouted a single word in Russian and they fell back. She faced Holmes across the narrow deck, hair wild, eyes blazing, the open handcuff still dangling from her wrist like a barbaric ornament. Holmes raised the dark lantern he had somehow kept throughout the chase and swung it 3 times in a wide arc, my signal. Far behind, police whistles shrilled. Lestrade's riverboats were already nosing out from the embankment, lanterns swinging. Chapter 10. The Final Deduction at Baker Street. 2 nights later, the sitting room at 221B glowed with the warmth of a blazing fire and the mellow light of our old gas chandelier. The great thaw had turned London into a city of dripping eaves and rushing gutters. The Thames ran high and brown, sweeping the last shards of ice toward the sea as though eager to be rid of its guilty memories. Outside, the November rain lashed the windows like 1,000 impatient fingers. But within we were snug and dry, and the scent of Mrs. Hudson's coffee mingled with the fragrant smoke of Holmes's post-case pipe. Around the hearth sat the principal actors in the strange drama we had just lived through. Lestrade, small and ferret-like, nursed a whiskey and soda. Elias Hawthorne, still pale and hollow-cheeked, stared into the flames as though he saw ghosts there. Clara Hawthorne, no longer the tragic widow but a prisoner in neat prison dress, sat between 2 wardresses, her wrists linked by the same steel cuffs that had glittered on the ice. And finally, wrapped in a dressing gown and with his wounded arm in a sling, Sherlock Holmes himself, pale but triumphant, his eyes brighter than I had seen them in months. When the coffee had been poured and the pipes lit, Holmes rose with that peculiar grace which pain seemed only to accentuate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have all been patient beyond praise. Tonight I shall lay before you the complete chain of this icy tragedy, link by frozen link, until even the most skeptical among you must acknowledge its strength." He turned first to Clara Hawthorne. She met his gaze without flinching, though the proud mouth trembled. "Madam, you were never the helpless widow you pretended. 5 years ago in St. Petersburg you were the confidant and, for a time, the lover of Countess Olga Voroninina, prima ballerina and poisoner. When the Countess fled Russia after murdering Grand Duke Sergei, you followed her to London, married Reginald Hawthorne for his position in the diamond trade, and together you built the most ingenious smuggling operation Europe has ever seen. Ice yachts from the Gulf of Finland brought Yakutsk stones hidden in hollow runners. Your private meteorological bulletins, obtained through your father's influence, told you exactly when snow would fall to cover murder on the Thames." He paused, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rain against the panes. "Reginald discovered the truth 6 months ago. He intended to expose the ring at the January meeting of the syndicate. You and the Countess decided he must die. The method was characteristically theatrical. Death by cyanide on the frozen river, footprints obliterated by predicted snow, a crimson rose as your joint signature. Percival Blaine, who had begun to suspect, was lured to the cold vault at Butler's Wharf and disposed of in the same fashion, the bolted door a simple trick with silk thread." Lestrade stirred. "But the woman we found in the iceworks, the one who shot herself?" "A loyal deputy. The real Countess Olga," Holmes bowed slightly to Clara, "stood before us all the time, wearing weeds and innocence like a mask. The scar you saw on the dead woman's cheek was skillfully faked with collodion. The locket and the Russian note were planted to mislead us. When I began to close the net, the Countess decided on a grand gesture. A midnight meeting on the breaking ice, ostensibly to bargain, in reality to kill me and escape downriver in the waiting yacht. A desperate gamble, but then love and desperation are old companions." Clara Hawthorne laughed once, a low, broken sound. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes. Cleverer than the Okrana, cleverer than Scotland Yard. But you will never understand. Olga and I were 2 halves of one soul. When they hanged her in effigy in St. Petersburg, something in me died too. The diamonds were nothing. The murders were—" She shrugged, a Gallic gesture that belonged to another life. "Necessary. The roses were our love letters, written in ice and blood." She lifted her manacled hands toward the firelight. "Love is stronger than ice, you said. You were wrong. Ice is love, cold, pure, eternal. Everything else melts. Holmes regarded her for a long moment with something that might almost have been pity. "Madam," he said quietly, "your ice has melted. The river runs free, the roses are withered, and tomorrow you will stand in the Old Bailey beside the memory of your lover. Love that demands murder is no longer love, it is a disease, and society must cauterize it." He turned to Elias Hawthorne, who had not spoken a word. "Your firm will survive, sir. The stones recovered from the yacht are sufficient to repair the losses. Go home, rebuild, and remember that honesty is the only diamond that never clouds." Lestrade snapped his notebook shut with a satisfied grunt. "A clean case, Mr. Holmes. Clean as any I've known." When they had all gone, the prisoner to her cell, Lestrade to his triumph, Elias Hawthorne to whatever future remained, Holmes sank back into his chair and reached for his violin. The fire had burned low. The rain had softened to a gentle patter. I filled our glasses and raised mine. "To the end of winter," I said. He smiled, that rare wintry smile that held more sadness than joy. "To the thaw, Watson, and to the knowledge that beneath the coldest ice beats a human heart, capable of the warmest love and the darkest crime." He drew the bow across the strings, and the room filled with the slow, mournful notes of Tchaikovsky's Pathétique, the Adagio Lamentoso. Outside, the rain fell softer still, washing London clean of its brief, terrible winter.